Arthur Schopenhauer is undoubtedly one of the greatest philosophers of all time, albeit undervalued, unappreciated, and misunderstood. His philosophical premises are considered controversial, and limited recognition can only after his death. The world as will and representation was the author's response to Immanuel Kant's transcendental idealism. Schopenhauer explores the genesis of being and many aspects of human nature through epistemology, ontology, aesthetics, ethics, and physiology. The world projects itself through space and time, and cause and effect relationships are ruled by a blunt natural force called will. The first decades after his publication, the world as will and representation was met with near silence. Exceptions were Goethe and Jean-Paul, on which Schopenhauer commented. In my opinion, the praise of one man of genius fully makes good the neglect of a thoughtless multitude. In part 2, we'll continue expanding our awareness of Schopenhauer's philosophy. Not merely that the world exists, but still more, that it is such a miserable and melancholy world is the tormenting problem of metaphysics. In part 1, we've touched on the important pieces of the world as will and representation, such as understanding of the idea of will by Schopenhauer, cognition, humans' unstoppable appetite for desire, suffering, and intellect as a tool to oppose the will. And now, we'll explore how Arthur Schopenhauer conceives the possibility of escaping the dark, omnipotent natural force he named will, and the correlation of his philosophy with other philosophical disciplines. Will for life is the most real of all things that we know, indeed the core of reality itself. Schopenhauer identifies the thing in itself, the inner essence of everything, as the will, a blind, striving, unstoppable force, devoid of knowledge, outside of space and time. When we direct our awareness inward, we would discover the restless striving at the core of our being, an unconscious instinct. This force at the core of our being Schopenhauer called will. The clear action of will, he thought, is displayed via raw desires or instinct, the will within us during the sexual act, and when our survival instincts are activated. He called it the will to live. What will aims at and achieves in human beings is indeed essentially no more than its goal in animals, nourishment and propagation. But through the organizations of the human beings, the requirements of achievement of that goal were so greatly enhanced that an enhancement of the intellect was necessary. So we tend to believe the main difference between humans and animals is intellect, or we may call it abstract thinking. Life itself is a sea full of rocks that man avoids with the greatest caution and care, although he knows that even when he succeeds with all his efforts and ingenuity in struggling through, at every step he comes nearer to the greatest, the total, the inevitable, irremediable shipwreck, namely death. This is the final goal of the wearisome voyage, and is worse for him than all the rocks that he has avoided. If this human existence were not dismal enough, Schopenhauer puts the final stamp upon it, the mark of unavoidable tragedy. For unlike all other animals that live in the present moment, we are aware that what awaits us after this miserable life of striving and suffering is the utter destruction of our individual being. What makes death so frightful to us is not so much the end of life, since this cannot seem to anyone particularly worth regretting, but rather the destruction of the organism. Living being does not suffer an absolute annihilation through death, but survives in and with the whole of nature. Hence we don't actually regret the end of life full of misfortune, but we fear the unknown that comes after the decimations of our physical bodies. Despite the resemblance of his ideas to Eastern philosophy, he did not believe in life after death. He thought the concept of the individual soul was just the presentation of the will. And here is what is interesting. If you view life as full of pointless suffering, then how can we define the purpose of life? According to Schopenhauer, it is a product of blind natural forces named will, which means the purpose is illusionary, a fruit of our imagination. Or he affirms that we don't die, but are transformed into the surrounding nature, so we could definitely feel better. Schopenhauer notes that suicide does not actually impact the will or any part of it, since death is merely the end of one particular phenomenon of the will. However, his philosophy may not seem so gloomy after all. What might otherwise be called the final part of life is purest joy, just because it lifts us out of real existence and transforms us into disinterested spectators of it, is pure knowledge, pleasure in the beautiful, genuine delight in art, which remains foreign to all willing. Although Schopenhauer thought that life as a whole makes no sense because it is filled with suffering and ends in death, he did admit that certain ecstatic and highly meaningful moments can drive us from our normal state of misery into a blissful peace of mind. Such liberating experiences arise when we contemplate a beautiful piece of art, a spectacular natural landscape, or an excellent piece of music. Then we come to the even brighter side, which provides hope to our miserable existence. Where rested an ordinary man, his faculty of knowledge is a lamp that lights his path. To the man of genius, it is the sun that reveals the world. Despite his gloomy forecast, Schopenhauer indicates that the will can be overcome by the intellectual realization that our mortal selves are mere slaves, our body is merely a will's representation, and that death, consequently, is not to be feared. According to Schopenhauer, an individual whose intellect is so powerful that it can escape its slavery by seeking knowledge is free from the will's desires and needs. This means that the task of arriving at knowledge of the true nature of the world, to silence the will, is a task fit only for the genius. Genius is an intellect that has changed its destiny defined by the will. Schopenhauer thought that the philosophical task of exposing the true inner nature of the world would be impossible, were it not for the fact that there is one object in the world that we can experience from within, our own body. Consequently, a way from within stands open to us, to that real inner nature of things to which we cannot penetrate from without. The objectivity of cognizance, and in the first instance of perceptual cognizance, has innumerable degrees, which rest on the energy of the intellect and its separation from the will, and the highest of which is genius. Also, Schopenhauer asserts that those most capable of removing themselves from the anguished condition of human existence are individuals especially drawn to the ecstatic experience of being absorbed in pure beauty. So he continues, enhancement of intelligence is the progressive detachment of intellect from will, which occurs complete, although only as an exception, in genius. Therefore, the latter can be defined as the highest degree of the objectivity of cognition. Schopenhauer thought that genius would arrive at the conclusion that all human beings are at their essence one, since all are manifestations of will. The compassionate individual understands that no matter how hard he tries to alleviate the suffering of others, his actions are futile, since as long as life exists, suffering will too. Pleasure in the beautiful consists to a large extent in the fact that when we enter the state of pure contemplation, we are raised for the moment above all willing, above all desires and cares. From this, we can infer how blessed must be the life of a man whose will is silenced not for a few moments, but forever, indeed completely extinguished. The individual who longs to silence his will forever must come to the realization of the true nature of will, and therefore the world itself. To attain such knowledge, one must use the intellectual faculty which makes humans capable of abstract thought. In the average individual, therefore, the intellect is the will's slave, and cannot break its chains and obtain the knowledge of the true nature of the world. Nothing can alarm and harass him anymore. Nothing can move him, for he has cut all the thousand filaments of willing which hold us bound to the world, and which, as appetite, fear, envy, and rage, drag us in constant pain. He now looks back, calm and smiling, upon the illusions of this world. Life as it forms now merely hangs before him as a fleeting appearance, like a light morning dream to one who is half awake. Schopenhauer continues emphasizing the way of liberation from the chains of blind, omnipotent, and unstoppable demonic force, in particular asceticism. According to Schopenhauer, his hatred is directed towards the manifestation of the will, which is his own being, and he proceeds to commit himself to asceticism, and thus denies gratification to his desires and stops chasing after the inducements of the world. Voluntary and complete chastity is the first step in asceticism, or the denial of the will to live. I refuse to be a slave of the will, affirms ascetic. After dedicating himself to chastity, the ascetic rejects all those desires which had previously kept him in a state of striving and pain, and assumes an attitude of complete indifference to everything. According to Schopenhauer, this description of the will denier is not a tale of an ideal, unreal condition, for as he noted, many individuals throughout history have devoted their lives to asceticism. Have they succeeded? Only they can answer. What remains after the complete abolition of the will, for all those who are still full of will? Assuredly nothing. But conversely, to those in whom the will has turned and denied itself, this very real world of ours, with all its suns and galaxies, is nothing. For those of us driven by the will, we will regard the ascetic, one who has destroyed the will within, as a fleshy ghost. However, realizing the worthlessness of will and all its manifestations, the ascetic regards this universe as nothing worthless. In fact, the state of mind attained by the ascetic is only nothing from our perspective, because it transcends conceptualization. To comprehend this state of mind, one must leave the limited domain of philosophy and proceed into mysticism. Mysticism is any guidance toward becoming immediately aware of that which neither perception nor concept, hence no cognizance at all reaches. The mystic contrasts with the philosopher by the fact that he begins from within, while the latter begins from without. The mystic advances from his inner, individual experience, where he finds himself as the eternal soul being. Nothing of this can be communicated but only through assertions, so he is unable to convince. The philosopher, contrary to mystic, proceeds from what is common to all, from the objective phenomenon presented before all, residing on the facts of self-consciousness, since they are to be found in everyone. Philosopher utilizes a method, as Schopenhauer writes, of reflection on all and combining the data given in it. For this reason, he is able to convince. Schopenhauer declares that people are really mere abstractions. Only individuals exist in actual reality. In ethics, the question is not of action or consequence, but of willing, and the willing itself only occurs in the individual. Individuals unified by the same cultural base or by method of influence form what we call nations. Schopenhauer applies the concept of ethics as residing solely on the individual basis, and therefore seeing will as a defining force. With respect to ethics, Schopenhauer continues to expand on individuality. The only world everyone is actually acquainted with and knows is carried about him in his head as his representation, and he is thus the center of the world. He finds himself to be the holder and possessor of all reality, and nothing to be more important to him than his own self. In the normal state of being enslaved to will, Schopenhauer claimed that we are all egoists. That is, we are concerned solely with our own self-interest, which is the natural condition of all humans. Egoism for Schopenhauer, although a natural state, was not an enviable state, for the egoist is wholly enslaved to his will and thus condemned to live a miserable life, either suffering in the pursuit of goals or plagued by a state of despair. Schopenhauer believed that the vast majority of humans would live and die as egoists and never attain any semblance of peace. Space and time, in which the possibility of all plurality rests, are mere forms belonging to our perception. The 7th century German philosopher Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, a member of the philosophical school known as rationalism, believed that through the use of one's reason, it was possible to obtain objective knowledge of the world. David Hume, an 18th century Scottish philosopher, who represented the philosophical school known as empiricism, on the contrary, viewed that all knowledge of the world can only be obtained through personal experience and therefore is always subjective, depending on a perspective, point of view, and other conditions of the subject. According to Hume, objective knowledge is not possible for human beings. In addition to the transcendental idealism of Immanuel Kant, the ideas of Leibniz and Hume, as well as resulting philosophical disputes, have significantly influenced the philosophy of Arthur Schopenhauer. What things may be in themselves, I know not, and yet not know because a thing is never presented to me otherwise than as a phenomenon. The ideas of both Leibniz and Hume also greatly influenced Immanuel Kant, an 18th century German philosopher who was given the nickname the All-Pulverizer for destroying the foundation of previous philosophies. This helped Kant to establish his position known as transcendental idealism, which appeared the platform on which Schopenhauer developed his philosophy. An essence of transcendental idealism is the distinction between the world as we experience it, which is the world of appearances or phenomenal world, and the world as it exists independent of our experience, which is what we would call a non-empirical world. According to Kant, we cannot obtain any knowledge of things in themselves. The world of appearances is the only one we can know, and this world is organized or structured by fundamental principles, in particular space and time, which Kant defines as forms of intuition, and also causality. Space, time, and causality are major categories that drive our experience of this world, and thus are not features of things in themselves. Space and time, in which the possibility of all plurality rests, are mere forms belonging to our perception. Empirical realism states that our presentation of things is based on our subjective experience in space and time, since they are real, while transcendental idealism indicates that they may appear only as our mental construct, including our mind and self, since things in themselves represent an idea totally different from our presentation. Kant found the word idealism incorrect because of the presence of empirical components of space and time and causality. However, can it be reconciled with his view that these experiences are mental constructs? Indeed, this is why Schopenhauer disagreed, as according to his interpretation of Kant's transcendental idealism, space, time, and causality are features of the mind or illusion. This means it makes no sense to speak of things in themselves causing our experience, as causation requires a knowing subject. We have immediate cognition of the thing in itself when it appears to us as our own body, but our cognition is only indirect when the thing in itself is objectified in other objects of intuition. In his work, Schopenhauer rejects most of Kant's ethics and significant parts of his epistemology and aesthetics. He believed that while, according to Kant, we cannot possess direct knowledge of what Kant called noumenon, or object existing independently of human senses, we may gain limited knowledge about it. This is because, according to Schopenhauer, the relationship between the world as a presentation and the world as it is in itself can be understood by investigating the relationship between our bodies and our will. He agreed with Kant that there must be some bedrock underlying our experience of the phenomenal world, yet he thought that we could not arrive at knowledge of it by just exploring the objects of our experience. Schopenhauer rejects Kant's doctrine of 12 categories of understanding. He believes that there are only 3 forms by which our minds render our experience of the world: time, space, and causality. He asserts that Kant's greatest point was the distinction between appearance and the thing in itself, proving that the intellect always stands between us and things, and thus we cannot know things as they may be in themselves. However, he finds Kant's introduction of things in themselves as vague and illogical. Connection to Greeks and Eastern philosophy. Schopenhauer acknowledges Plato's influence on the development of his theories, particularly in the context of aesthetics. He speaks of the Platonic forms as existing on an ontological level between the representation and the will. As well, his idea of will coincides with the thinking of Aristotle. For Aristotle, natural ends are produced by natures, which are principles of change internal to living things. This natural force is what Schopenhauer called will. Schopenhauer notes fundamental agreements between his philosophy and the philosophy of the ancient Indian Vedas. Everything in life proclaims that earthly happiness is destined to be frustrated or recognized as an illusion. The grounds for this lie deep in the very nature of things. Since everything in this world, organic and inorganic alike, is a manifestation of will, at its core everything is one with everything else. So the separateness of all things is just an illusion. This conclusion reflects the basis of Hinduism found in Upanishads. Schopenhauer arrived at this position independently prior to being acquainted with the Upanishads. As to Hinduism, this concept of will makes us think of the idea of Brahman. However, Schopenhauer has assigned to this concept a negative connotation. Or at least this is how we can see it. My understanding is that Brahman is presented in Hinduism as neither negative nor positive, as these characteristics can only exist in a human world. A cognizing of things in themselves, in the strictest sense of the word, would be impossible, because where the essence in itself of things begins, cognition falls away, and all cognizance fundamentally and essentially pertains merely to phenomena. Schopenhauer independently, or perhaps assisted by Immanuel Kant, came to the concepts of Buddhism, discovering that our apprehension of the world is an illusion. Buddhism characterizes this essence of things in itself as prajnaparamita, or beyond all cognition. Accordingly, Schopenhauer's concept of desire, described in Part 1, has strong parallels in Buddhist thought. Buddhism identifies the individual's pervasive sense of dissatisfaction as a cause of craving, roughly similar to what Schopenhauer would call the will to live. Both offer remedies for this condition, which include contemplative, ascetic activities. He was among the first thinkers in Western philosophy to share and affirm teachings of Eastern philosophy, in particular asceticism, the world as appearance, having initially arrived at similar conclusions as the result of his philosophical work. There are some aspects correlating with Stoic philosophy when things are accepted while realizing that they in itself are different from when we apply our sensual or emotional label to them. He affirms Stoic equanimity, which seeks to disarm every misfortune through readiness for them all and contempt for all, in practice becomes the renunciation of the cynics, which prefers to cast aside, once and for all expedients and alleviations. Both Schopenhauer and the Stoics share a view of reason as having a key salvation role, despite the secondary status the former gives to reason from an ontological standpoint. Schopenhauer recognized similarities between his thought and Stoic ethics, often defending what he saw as the true essence of Stoicism. It is possible that in the philosophy of Nietzsche and Wittgenstein, aspects of Stoicism could come from their readings of Schopenhauer, although Nietzsche has turned away from the Schopenhauer theory of salvation as will denying to the Stoics' philosophical therapy of reason. Both Schopenhauer and the Stoics engaged reason as a tool to achieve liberation from the traps of the will and mental independence, respectively. What previously possessed him completely and moved him intensely appears to him cold, colorless, and for the moment foreign and strange. He is a mere spectator and observer. Stoic sage, the representative of the true spirit of Stoicism, is an important figure in the context of Schopenhauer's wider scheme of salvation. He marks the idealized Stoic sage as potentially one of the most important characters in his thought, demonstrating the power of reason. Stoic sage is offering an ideal. This is at least close to Schopenhauer's endpoint of the complete self-denial and negation of the will. Stoicism and Schopenhauer ultimately see salvation as involving a state of mind culminating in a complete state of awareness and self-knowledge, devoid of painful desires and emotions. We also saw the idealized figure of the Stoic sage as being perhaps one of the most significant figures in Schopenhauer's system, unmistakably reflecting the kind of figure who will at least come close to absolute will denial, if not absolutely achieving that perfect state of self-knowledge. We can argue here that Stoicism does not include the complete elimination of desires and emotions, but, most important, a control of them. A god who should presume to transform himself into such a world would certainly have been inevitably troubled and tormented by the devil. Schopenhauer's praise for asceticism led him to think highly of Buddhism and Vedanta, Hinduism, as well as some monastic orders and ascetic practices found in Catholicism. He expressed contempt for Protestantism, Judaism, and Islam, which he saw as too optimistic, lacking metaphysics, and cruel to animals. Certain philosophers throughout history, Spinoza in particular, have ascribed to pantheism and the claim that this world is the manifestation of a divine and benevolent God. Schopenhauer, being an atheist, thought the pantheist position to be ludicrous, for he proclaimed that if the pantheist opened his eyes to the misery of this world, he would have to admit that a God who should presume to transform himself into such a world would certainly have been inevitably troubled and tormented by the devil. Instead of being a manifestation of God, Schopenhauer thought the world is a manifestation of will, a blind demonic force. This force is manifesting itself in all life striving towards nourishment and propagation. For if anything in the world is desirable, so desirable that even the dull and uneducated herd in its more reflective moments would value it more than silver and gold, it is that a ray of light should fall on the obscurity of our existence, and that we should obtain some insight into this enigmatical life of ours, in which nothing is clear except its misery and vanity. Schopenhauer believed the role of philosophy was to shed a ray of light on the darkness of this miserable existence, and in doing so provide consolation for the fragile and wretched human animal. Arthur Schopenhauer has finally stated, "Subject to the limitation of human knowledge, my philosophy is the real solution to the enigma of the world."